Deep in eastern Ukraine, nestled inside the vital Donetsk Oblast, stands Toretsk. Once a bustling city of around 30,000 people, Toretsk has been reduced to a shell of its former self thanks to Russian President Vladimir Putin's brutal order to take the city. Now, only dozens of civilians remain alongside soldiers and corpses. Thousands of them, with the vast majority of them being Russian. Toretsk is the stadium of death for Russia, as Putin has sacrificed 50,000 of his soldiers. And he still can't break the city. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which on August 2nd reported on comments made by Major Serhiy Kaminsky, the press officer for Ukraine's 100th Mechanized Brigade, which to this day is involved in the defense of this vital city. Kaminsky says that Putin has sacrificed far more troops than could ever be worth it to the altar of Toretsk. 50,000 people, that's a good-sized European stadium filled to the brim. But the Kremlin regime didn't bring these people for football. It brought them to die near Toretsk, Kaminsky said in a YouTube video published by the Ukrainian army on August 1st. Of those 50,000 soldiers, 20,000 are believed to have suffered irreversible casualties, Euromaidan reports. That means they're either dead and likely have been left to rot on the burned-out streets of Toretsk, or they've been injured to such a serious extent that it would be impossible for Putin to send them back out to war. And when considering the fact that Putin is a leader who has a track record of recycling his wounded troops to the point where he sends them back to the front lines on crutches, those must be some major injuries. This is far from the first time that extensive Russian losses have been heard about inside Toretsk. Putin wants the city badly, and he's been allowing his troops to die to get it since 2024. In March 2025, RBC Ukraine reported that Russia was not only experiencing a massive casualty rate, but also had over 13,000 soldiers missing in action who were supposed to be fighting in Toretsk. Many of those soldiers were likely dead, with their deaths going unrecorded as their comrades simply left them behind on the streets where they fell. It also seems likely that at least some of the 13,000 who were unaccounted for at that time deserted. After all, it was also in March that Forbes reported that over 50,000 Russian soldiers had gone absent without leave since the Ukraine war began. Some of them likely range from the desolate battleground of Toretsk. Given the massive casualty rate that's now known Russia has suffered in the city, it's easy to see why. The obvious question now is, how is this happening? After all, Russia has a clear numbers advantage in Toretsk. It would need to, if it's lost 50,000 soldiers and counting to Putin's desperate efforts to take the city. Part of the reason why that casualty rate is so high is because of the efforts of Ukraine's 100th separate Mechanized Brigade. It's this brigade that's held what Euromaidan Press calls a crucial front line for more than a year amidst Russia's assaults. When Putin ordered his forces to break through Horlivka on the way to Konstantinovka, the 100th Brigade stood in their way, and it still stands. This is one of the front sectors where the enemy has made the least progress. It frustrates them, but they can't change anything thanks to the heroism of our fighters, Kaminsky said in the Ukrainian army video. Frustration appears to have turned to desperation, as the Russian fighters have failed to break through, exhausting their supplies in the process. They've tried every tactic in the book to break Ukraine's Toretsk defense, and all have failed. Armored assaults have fallen to Ukraine's clever use of drones and anti-tank warfare. Nighttime infantry storm attacks crumble to Ukraine's defense, as even soldiers moving under the cover of night are vulnerable to Ukrainian first-person view or FPV drones equipped with thermal cameras. No matter what Russia has thrown at Toretsk, all it's been met with is a brave defense that's destroyed thousands of its soldiers. You could say the only things we haven't seen are battle kangaroos and penguins. Everything else has been tried, Kaminsky jokes. Hard to put it past Putin. This is a man responsible for over 1.05 million Russian soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in his war. What would a little animal cruelty on top of that mean to a man who clearly places practically no value in the very real human lives he's sacrificing in Ukraine? Russia's desperation to take Toretsk has led to it ordering the use of ground robotic combat systems in the city. Such systems aren't necessarily a bad idea. Ukraine itself has innovated the use of plenty of them. On July 14, the Atlantic Council pointed out that Ukraine has used ground drones for everything, from storming enemy trenches to delivering supplies and evacuating its soldiers from the front lines. But from those uses, there's a hint as to what ground drones are best at: traversing relatively open territory, such as that seen in the fields and woodland where trench warfare is common. In an urban environment like Toretsk, where rubble lines the streets, and the only real routes for ground drones are the few remaining roads that are wide open and easily assaulted, these robots are as vulnerable as the troops that Putin has sacrificed. High-rise buildings turned into thousands of tons of rubble, Kaminsky says of the terrain Russia's new robots must traverse. These roads are hard to pass even for a human, let alone a robotic system. So, not only is Putin ordering strikes that result in thousands of his soldiers getting killed or injured, but he's displaying his tactical ineptitude in other ways. Ground drones shouldn't be in Toretsk. They're nowhere near mobile enough to root out Ukraine's defenders or do anything about them. Perhaps Putin intends to use these drones as he uses his soldiers, cannon fodder that exists to soak up more of Ukraine's bullets. Through it all, Ukraine holds on, and to understand why, it's important to dig deeper into the battle for Toretsk and why it's so important to both Ukraine and Russia. Russia's assault on Toretsk began on June 18, 2024, as part of Putin's renewed 2024 effort to take the Donetsk Oblast. That's not to say that the city wasn't subjected to attacks before that date, but it was on June 18 that the assaults intensified to the point where Ukraine realized that Russia had launched a full-blown campaign to take the city. The Russian advance took it to within 1.86 miles of the Toretsk border by June 28, with more slight gains in the surrounding areas, eventually leading to Russia managing to enter the city itself in August 2024. For months, the battle raged on, with Russia managing to advance tiny amounts every day as the first few thousand, or what would become the 50,000 Kaminsky speaks about, were thrown into the meat grinder Putin intended to create. This would be a battle of attrition, and Russia's president believed he had the numerical advantage he needed to take Toretsk. By January 6, Russia had managed to advance to the northwestern boundary of the city, holding anywhere between 71 and 90% of the city, depending on which sources were believed at the time. Ukraine's forces were being pushed to Toretsk outskirts, though they were still mounting a brave defense that was causing the attacking Russians to lose thousands of their troops. Then it happened, the Russian victory declaration. On February 7, 2025, the Moscow Times reported that Russia was claiming to have finally captured Toretsk. The news was welcomed by Russian military bloggers and correspondents at the time, including one named Alexander Kots, who the outlet quotes as asking an important question. "Excuse me, but do we need negotiations at this rate?" said Kots. That question came as US President Donald Trump began his push for a ceasefire in the Ukraine conflict in earnest, and it's important because of a simple fact. Russia hadn't actually taken Toretsk. As soon as the Kremlin announced the city's capture, Ukraine was quick to deny that Toretsk had fallen completely under Russian control. The announcement of Russia's victory seemed to be yet another ploy by Putin to make it seem like he had more leverage than he did for upcoming peace negotiations. Simply put, Russia lied about the status of Toretsk, and there are plenty more lies just like it, as you can find out in our video covering Russia's recent claim to have taken Chasiv Yar, along with several other lies Putin is told during a supposed special military operation. The reality was that the fighting still raged in Toretsk. In late February through to early March, Ukraine launched a massive counterattack that saw it almost encircle the Russian forces occupying northern Toretsk. The Institute for the Study of War also pointed out that Ukraine had a quantitative drone advantage in the city and was actively conducting reconnaissance missions and sabotage around some of Toretsk's most important mines. More on those mines in a moment. Though Russia reportedly managed to repel the Ukrainian counterattack, Toretsk was far from being as occupied as the country claimed. In April, UA Wire reported that Ukraine still held a number of strategic positions within the city, which they were defending against Russian assaults. Ukraine's positions were elevated, defendable, and the adverse weather conditions of the time meant that Russia was trying to advance onto slag heaps it was using as makeshift fortifications. It's easy to surmise how all of this helped to contribute to the 50,000 casualties and counting that Russia has experienced in the city. The point here is that Russia's push for Toretsk has been as brutal on Putin's troops as it had been on Ukraine's defenders. Yes, Russia controls most of the city, but most doesn't mean all, and Ukraine's defenses are still so rigid in the few parts of Toretsk that Russia doesn't occupy that Putin is being forced to expend thousands more of his troops just to stand a chance of dislodging them. If the 100th Brigade has anything to say about it, that situation will continue for many months more, costing Putin many more of his soldiers as he tries and fails to take a city in which he's already claimed victory. Sadly, Toretsk is now a ghost town. Pictures published by RBC Ukraine on April 14 show once proud buildings blackened by artillery fire, shells of their former selves. A city that once had a population exceeding 30,000 had just 48 people remaining at the time. All roads being under heavy shelling meant that evacuation efforts for those few remaining civilians were failing. Still, Ukraine defended. And that leads to perhaps the most important question of this video. Why is Putin so hell-bent on taking Toretsk? After all, his troops have practically razed the city to the ground, so it's clear he doesn't want Toretsk for any sort of cultural appeal or because he cares about making Toretsk a bustling part of his vision of a new Russia. But there are plenty of reasons why Putin is willing to sacrifice 50,000 soldiers or more to the Ukrainians who still defend Toretsk, starting with something touched on earlier. Toretsk is a mining town. The city had been developed for coal mining during the 19th century, and coal was still being mined according to BBC reports way back in May 2022. At that time, while the city had already been shelled, including a strike on a coal mine in June that caused civilian casualties, it had not yet seen the sustained bombardment that would later turn it into a ghost town. Ukraine's coal miners were still working, even amidst the thuds of the occasional artillery strike. Obviously, Russia needs more coal. As the Moscow Times reported on July 28, the country's coal industry is on the verge of collapsing as a combination of declining global prices and sanctions has severely hurt the sector. The figures make for unhappy reading for Putin. Back in 2022, global consumption coal growth was 4.7%. By 2024, that growth had slowed to just 1%, which sent prices plummeting from $400 per ton at the end of 2022 to $100 by May 2025. This general collapse of coal growth would make any right-thinking person believe that Toretsk isn't worth the effort for its mines alone. But that assumes that Putin isn't stuck in his ways. Coal, despite its troubles, is still an important industry for Russia. It accounted for about 1% of the country's gross domestic product back in 2020. And Putin likely believes that he can make more money from coal in a future where Russia has taken over even more parts of Ukraine. Toretsk is a place where he can get more coal, which means it's also a place that can deliver more money to Russia. However, that's a potential future benefit. The coal mines aren't operational right now, as Toretsk is still a war zone where tens of thousands of Russians are dying. In the more immediate sense, Putin also wants Toretsk because it's a strategically significant city. Euromaidan Press points this out in the same report in which it covers the stadium of death aspect of the fight for the city. Toretsk lies on critical logistical routes leading to Konstantinovka, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the outlet says. Capturing Toretsk would disrupt Ukrainian logistics and facilitate further Russian advances toward key administrative centers in Donbas. This mirrored comments made by The Telegraph back in February, when Putin was claiming that Russia had taken Toretsk. In a report, ironically titled, "The Town Russia Couldn't Take," which immediately dispels the notion that Russia held Toretsk, The Telegraph points out that the city is just 12 miles southeast of Konstantinovka. That city was mentioned earlier as one that Putin has set his sights on. He wants Konstantinovka because reaching that city would allow Russia to launch stronger assaults against other urban strongholds, including the previously mentioned Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, along with Druzhkivka and Lyman. Take those cities and control of Donetsk follows. That's Putin's ultimate goal with his Toretsk assault. Along with being able to use the city as a staging ground for an advance into Konstantinovka, Russia would also be able to sever some of the logistical arteries upon which Ukraine relies to keep its troops supplied and moving through Donetsk. The mines would be a bonus. Victory for Russia in Toretsk sets the stage for the full capture of Donetsk, at least in Putin's mind. And boy, does Putin want Donetsk. What being seen in Toretsk right now is just a microcosm of Putin's much larger campaign to take the Donetsk Oblast. Beginning in earnest in 2024, though Donetsk has been a focus for Putin since he launched his invasion, that offensive is vital to Putin for several reasons. The first of these reasons is somewhat symbolic. Donetsk and the wider Donbas region, of which Donetsk is a part, are pieces of territory that Putin sees as Russian in all but name already. He'll use the fact that around a third of the Donbas population is ethnic Russian, and that Russian is the most widely spoken language in the Donbas, as evidence of his claims. The Donbas, in general, lies far away from the more metropolitan hubs of Kyiv and the rest of western Ukraine, which also feeds into the area having a different cultural identity. As a result, pro-Russian separatist movements have existed in Donbas and Donetsk for years. It was by leaning on these movements that Putin was able to launch his first campaign of aggression in eastern Ukraine back in 2014. That time, Russia failed, though it did manage to annex Crimea. What's being seen now, in Putin's full-blown invasion, is a leader who's attempting to finish the job he started back in 2014. Donetsk and the Donbas will become part of Russia because that's what they were always supposed to be, at least in Putin's twisted ideology. But if it seems like it was just symbolic significance that makes Donetsk such a big part for Putin, then think again. As is so often the case, there's an ulterior motive at play. Minerals. A lot of minerals. Beyond the coal in Toretsk that's already been spoken about, Ukraine is home to 22 of the 34 minerals that the European Union classifies as critical. Al Jazeera reported back in February. Those mineral deposits are huge, with Ukraine believed to account for 5% of the global supply of critical mineral reserves as of 2022, including 7% of the world's titanium and about 500,000 tons of its lithium. Ukraine has 20,000 registered mineral deposits, of which 8,700 are proven, and it's home to 117 of the world's 120 most used metals and minerals. And guess where a large proportion of these deposits are located? Yes, Donetsk. The Donbas in general is a mineral-rich gold mine that Putin wants to claim. With those minerals comes cash and, perhaps more importantly, global influence. Donetsk lithium alone makes a huge get for Russia's president. The region is home to the Shevchenko field of lithium ores, which is one of Ukraine's largest deposits of a material that's used in most of the world's batteries. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands of billions of dollars of these minerals in the Donbas. Putin, for all his bluster about wanting to take Donetsk for the ethnic Russians who call the region home, is really more interested in the money and influence control over that region would grant Russia. Toretsk could be the key to taking Donetsk. That's why Putin is happy to sacrifice 50,000 of his soldiers, along with however many more are to come to take the city. It's also why Ukraine is so fervently defending a city that's been practically destroyed by Russia's shelling. Russia may yet take Toretsk. Putin has proven himself as nothing if not more than willing to throw his own soldiers into the meat grinder to get what he wants. Over 1 million casualties and counting can attest to that. But if Russia is to take Toretsk, it's practically guaranteed it won't do it without sustaining yet more damage from the 100th Brigade and Toretsk's other brave defenders. Even if Toretsk falls, it won't be clear sailing for Russia. There are still more urban settlements that Ukraine is defending in Donetsk that will claim tens of thousands more Russian lives before Putin controls the region, assuming he ever gains control at all. And it's not just in Toretsk where Russia's military is trying and failing. Near Lyman, Ukraine is using ancient Roman tactics to wipe out Russia's soldiers with a 66-to-1 kill ratio. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments in the Ukraine war.